Good afternoon. Welcome to the third and final day of the symposium Revere in Perspective, Artisanry, Labor, and Luxury, which is hosted by the Center for Historic American Visual Culture at the American Antiquarian Society. My name is Nan Wolverton. I'm the Director of Fellowships at the Society and the Director of the Center for Historic American Visual Culture, or CHAVIC. Many of you have joined us over the past 2 days for this symposium, and we thank you for being with us. If you missed those sessions, please know that they will be available on our YouTube channel and also linked from the CHAVIC page on the AAS website in the coming days. Before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that the American Antiquarian Society is built on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc people. We honor the Nipmuc and the other Algonquin tribes in Massachusetts as the original caretakers of this land, and they are still here. As a national research library, the American Antiquarian Society is devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of this nation before the 20th century. Our collections are vast and include books, newspapers, manuscripts, children's literature, and graphic arts, such as prints, maps, photographs, and ephemera. CHAVIC was established at the Society to help bring greater attention to our graphic arts collections through fellowships, as well as through programs like this one. And I'd like here to introduce my colleague, Lauren Hewes, the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Graphic Arts at the Society and the Interim Vice President for Collections. And there's Lauren, who will be joining us today and will be chairing today's panel. Lauren worked with me as co-curator of the exhibition Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere, which features many rare engravings by Revere in our collections, including many of those that you'll see in today's papers. The exhibition opened at the New York Historical Society in September of 2019 and is now on view in Massachusetts at the Worcester Art Museum and at the Concord Museum. The show was split between those two venues in Massachusetts. After being shuttered back in March due to the pandemic, both venues have now reopened, and you can check their websites for details about seeing the exhibition there. And I would like to thank the Richard C. von Hess Foundation and the Henry Luce Foundation for their generous support of the exhibition. I'd also like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for support of CHAVIC, and especially on this day, Michael Buehler of Boston Rare Maps for his support of this symposium. Today, we will start with our third panel, which is entitled Local Perspectives, Prints and Production. And that panel will end today at 3:15, and our final session will be a roundtable that will begin at 3:30. So that roundtable will include all speakers from the symposium, but you will need to sign in to a separate link for that roundtable. But we will end at 3:15. We've gone till 3:30 the previous 2 days because the discussion has been so robust, but we will be prompt and end on time, so you have a break before the roundtable. Before we get this started with today's presentations, I just want to say a few things about our Zoom webinar format. Please note that we are recording this program. We cannot see or hear you, but you will have the option of asking questions of the speakers during the Q&A. And that you can do at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to introduce my colleague, Amanda Condict, who is going to just give a few words of instruction about the technology associated with the webinar. Amanda, would you like to show there we are.
Hey, thank you, Nan. Hi, everyone, and welcome. As Nan mentioned, I'll be the technical support for this afternoon. So if you have any questions about your visual or audio settings, message me in the chat function, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will also be posting lots of links in the chat relating to our speaker and to the symposium, so check that out as well. And if you have any questions for Teresa or Nancy, please type them in the Q&A section, which is also at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over those during our Q&A segment. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And do note that if you want to save your chat for later on, you can click on the 3 dots in the chat window, and that way you can retain all of the information that Amanda will be putting in there. Again, keep in mind that your questions will go into the Q&A rather than into the chat. And I will now turn things over to Lauren to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Nan. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm really delighted to be hosting the third session of Revere in Perspective. Those of you who have been with us since Wednesday, since we started on Wednesday, I think we have all gotten quite a good overview of Revere and his world, his networks. Yesterday, we took a real global perspective of the kind of work that Revere was doing and the world that he was living in. This panel is going to be a little different. This panel, as Nan said, is entitled Prints and Production, and we're going to take a really different approach. It's going to be a very focused approach on two engravings in particular that Revere did, one in the 1760s and one in the 1770s. Again, I just want to reiterate, if you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen, of your Zoom screen. And if you are, if you're a little shy and you don't want to ask questions, but you see a good one there, you can upvote by liking the question, and that will push the question to the top of the queue. So I encourage you to do that. That's worked really well for the last couple of days. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Teresa Fairbanks Harris. So Teresa, would you start your screen and your audio, please? There she is. So Teresa Fairbanks Harris has been the senior cataloger for works on paper at the Yale Center for British Art and the Yale University Art Gallery since 1982. Prior to that time, she was the conservator at the National Museum of American History and the Conservation Analytical Laboratory at the Smithsonian. She has taught and researched broadly in the area of conservation, artists' materials and techniques, and in the history of paper. Her work has brought her in close contact with prints and drawings by artists including Edward Manet, Leonardo da Vinci, and John Singleton Copley. Today, she will be speaking about her long experience with the prints of Paul Revere, especially the multiple printings that she has examined of his iconic depiction of the Boston Massacre. Teresa.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good, because it's very small, but can you see the full screen?
Yes, I can see the full screen.
Okay, great. My talk centers on the iconic image of the Boston Bloody Massacre and the evolution of this print. The Boston Massacre was a deadly riot that occurred on March 5th, 1770, on King Street in Boston. It began as a street brawl with colonists harassing a lone British soldier. With reinforcements from both sides.
Teresa, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are not seeing your screen.
Oh, okay. Let's.
So we're going to share your
Yeah.
screen again. Thank you to the folks who popped into the chat and said, I can't see her.
Ah, now we can. Okay.
Okay, let's see now. Can we see it now? Let's see.
Yeah.
There we go.
All right. So sorry.
That's right. Yes, people are saying yes, they can see it. Thank you, Teresa.
Oh, no problem. Could you hear me before?
Yes.
Good, because I don't need to repeat myself as it's a short talk. And basically, with the reinforcements from both the colonists and the British, this small brawl quickly escalated into a chaotic, bloody slaughter. 3 colonists were killed and 2 additional wounded. They died later. The conflict energized anti-British sentiment and paved the way for the American Revolution. My technical examination of this famous print began when a Yale University Art Gallery curator asked me if I could conserve it for an upcoming traveling exhibition. The exhibition was entitled Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Upon examination, it was found that the red lead-based paint used for depicting blood and the redcoats was flaking. The red had oxidized and turned black so that it no longer represented the horror of the incident. I recommended that the discolored blood and redcoats could be chemically returned to its former color, after which then it would be safe to secure the flaking paint to the support. This is a detail of the after treatment, showing that now you can see red. Georgia Barnhill, former curator at AAS, encouraged me to look deeper into the various impressions of this print. Multiple prints can be made from a plate. Intaglio prints can vary dramatically between impressions, and hundreds can be printed, making them ideal for political propaganda. Revere's print was included in a Boston Gazette broadside printed on March 12, 1770, along with 5 coffins Revere engraved to represent the fallen colonist. The hand coloring of individual prints with watercolor heightened the sense of violence. Henry Pelham, we see on the left, is John Singleton Copley's stepbrother. It's also a painting by Copley. He was actually the original creator of the Bloody Massacre design. Revere took Pelham's design and had 200 prints made before Pelham even published his print on April 2nd. Pelham was unhappy with Revere, but there was no real copyright. Pelham's print had a different border, text, and design than Revere's did. It is also more accomplished since Pelham was trained as a pictorial artist. He, as I said, was John Singleton Copley's stepbrother. There are many copies of Revere's print. They were advertised for sale March 26 and were probably available by March 28th. The original Revere plate still exists and was reprinted in the 19th and the 20th century. This is one of the best impressions of Revere's print. It is quite elaborately painted and colored by Christian Remick, as you can see in the slide on the left in the slide. If we have a closer comparison of the Revere's and Pelham's prints without their borders, you can see that they are almost identical if you remove the coloring. Revere was not responsible for all of the versions of the Bloody Massacre. The print was such a success that others borrowed the same design. Here we can see on the top right, Revere's design, and then in the upper left, Pelham's design. A mulligan on the lower right and a Bingley on the bottom left, and we will discuss them all individually. Despite the coloring, the etching and engraving are very close between the Mulligan copy and Revere's copy. He does sign it Mulligan, and he doesn't credit Revere with the actual print itself. In London, Bingley had the etching on the right, made following Pelham's design, altering the border text a little bit. There were additional Bloody Massacres that were made in the 19th century, and we will look at them now. Here is the Revere copy by William Stratton, who made it in 1832. It was a facsimile. He was not just out and out copying it. You can see on the bottom that he acknowledges that it's a facsimile. We published March 5th in 1832. Copies exist both colored and colored, as in the other Reveres. Numerous massacre prints exist, and one has to look very carefully to determine if the print and the coloring is vintage or not. The print in the upper right appears to have, in the upper left, appears to have whites that look strange to me. Revere cut off the text from the plate to re-engrave money for the colonist. Copies without text are printed after Revere's life. The two on the right are both restrikes after the plate was cut down. The bottom left is a photomechanical reproduction made in the 20th century. In many original 18th century impressions, the paper is quite dark because of its long framing with wood backings, as you can see in the slide. Quite a few were framed, which is probably why so many have actually survived. The historic frames and glass should be kept, including an acid barrier to isolate the print from the wood backing. Here is a modern craftsman hand coloring a 20th century Bloody Massacre. He is working in the Eads and Gill Boston print shop, now relocated in Faneuil Hall, Boston. One needs to learn to identify recoloring, which is not uncommon. Recoloring may appear too bright You may see it seep through the back. You may also see an unusual water tide line and unusual absorption because the paper has degraded and someone's recolored it, and it doesn't take the watercolor in the same way as it would when it was originally printed. Transmitted raking and ultraviolet light are very good to look at the paper and pigments. Ultraviolet helps evaluate the print's ultraviolet helps evaluate the pigments and any sort of damages to the paper and restoration. Magnification with a hand magnifier or microscope assists in determining printing process, coloring, and the quality of the impression. Here we see a binocular microscope, which is a wonderful tool. Identification of the type of paper used for the impression can tell you whether it is appropriate for the period. Watermarks are difficult to identify, but some that have been noted include the crown fleur-de-lis and a shield with the LVG below in the upper left. J. Whatman paper was also used with a crown fleur-de-lis, and there's no picture of that one. The Strasbourg lily is sometimes seen, and we have a detail of that in the upper right, and possibly a three-lobed pendant from a similar watermark. The prints are so small that there may not be a watermark. It may be a part of the paper that didn't have the actual mark. Vintage prints should be on antique laid paper with shadowing along the chain lines. As you can see in the upper left, there is a greater density of paper pulp. And that's how the paper was until the introduction of modern laid molds. Wove molds were also introduced mid-century, but both of these types of paper, the modern laid and the wove, required new molds. And so I haven't seen Revere prints that are vintage on these types of papers because they didn't really get commonly used until the end of the century. Also, just because it has the LVG that you see in the upper left, it's not necessarily made by Lambertus Engraving. His watermark was adopted by other paper makers because it would indicate that it was a very, very high quality paper. If you became a famous paper maker, people would adopt your watermark. Crispus Attucks was the first person to be shot and killed in the Boston Massacre. He was of mixed race, believed to be descended from Blacks and Native Americans. Attucks became a martyr and a hero. And in this detail, you can see below, he's just toned slightly darker. But up above, you can see it's been painted dark, and I have a detail of that next. It looks like it's actually been cut out of the paper, painted, or torn out of the paper, and then replaced with the darker skin. Sometimes he's not painted with a darker skin, but he does appear in all of the prints because he's in the original plate. Reinterpretations of the massacre were produced in the fight for freedom and abolition in the 19th century. In this print from 1856, Crispus Attucks in the front and center. He is a martyr and a heroic figure fighting and dying for liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. We'll have some questions we'll wait for the questions all together after Nancy's presentation. So, oh, there she goes. She's already gone. Our next speaker is Nancy Siegel. Nancy Siegel is Professor of Art History at Towson University in Maryland and specializes in American landscape studies, print culture, and culinary history of the 18th and 19th centuries. Currently, she is completing a manuscript entitled Political Appetites, Revolution, Taste, and Culinary Activism in the Early Republic. and is curating an international exhibition of historical cartoons called Curious Taste, the Transatlantic Appeal of Satire, scheduled to open in 2023. Nancy was a previous fellow here at AAS and was elected to membership in the Society in 2018. She has lectured widely on culinary history and led the 2015 Chavik Seminar, Culinary Culture, the Politics of American Foodways, 1765 to 1900. Nancy was also the contract registrar for the Society's exhibition Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere, for which I say a big thank you for all your help on that. And she contributed an essay to the exhibition's catalog, which I believe is in the chat if anyone's interested in the catalog. Her talk today focuses on Revere's 1766 engraving of an obelisk constructed in Boston to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. Nancy.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you, Nan, for inviting me to take part in Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere, and also this very exciting symposium. And thank you to those of you who are attending today and to my colleagues, and also Teresa for your fantastic presentation. And also I wanted to say thank you to Chief Conservator Babette Genrich, who did just such a remarkable job with the condition and conserving so many of the works that are in this beautiful exhibition. So, Paul Revere was enmeshed within the socio-political fabric of colonial Boston. His involvement in community building and political activism, combined with the relationships he cultivated, both professional and personal, present a finely detailed understanding of this man, while his engravings are significant as both aesthetic and historical documents. This afternoon, I wanted to isolate one work by Revere related to events surrounding the repeal of the Stamp Act in March of 1766 to demonstrate the intertwined nature of his life and work. The Stamp Act, representative of increasing economic and political conflict between Great Britain and her Northern American colonies during the mid-1760s, proved to be a pivotal act of Parliament as it resulted in significant resistance by the colonists. Due in part to Britain's implied authority to impose taxation measures, it is not surprising, therefore, that when the Stamp Act was passed in November of '65 and effective in March, the strain on transatlantic relations appeared throughout the growing media of newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides. However, unlike other taxes, the Stamp Act was short-lived, and with its repeal a year later, on March 18, 1766, much fanfare and celebration occurred. Once word arrived in the colonies, church bells rang, guns were fired, ships in the harbor displayed their colors, while Staffordshire potters were quick to export wares that capitalized on this reversal, and broadsides declared glorious news on May 16th. 3 days later, on May 19th, a public celebration took place in Boston. The Boston Evening Post printed the following advertisement: "I do therefore notify the Friends of Liberty that an authentic account of the repeal of the Stamp Act is arrived, and the gentlemen selectmen of Boston have fixed upon this evening for the public rejoicing, at whose desire will be exhibited on the Common an obelisk, a description of which is engraved by Mr. Paul Revere and is now selling by Eady's and Gill." Paul Revere's engraving, a view of the obelisk under Liberty Tree in Boston on the rejoicings for the repeal of the Stamp Act, depicts the substantial structure, as mentioned in the Post, that was the showpiece for the finale of the evening's event. Designed and constructed most likely by members of the Sons of Liberty, including Revere, the obelisk was lit by 280 lamps and intended to be placed under the Liberty Tree as a standing monument. Unfortunately, after hours of vibrant celebration, the lamps that illuminated the obelisk supposedly were not properly extinguished, and the monument was ultimately consumed in flames. It existed for less than 24 hours. We do not know with certainty who designed and built the structure, nor do we know how long it would have survived given its oil paper sides. We don't even know how tall it was, despite a claim of 4 stories high. And with the exception of newspaper reports detailing the events of the celebration at which the obelisk took center stage, we have few facts. And yet, though it lasted for just a day, the obelisk represents an important signifier of public sentiment in a time of caution and turbulence. Revere's engraving is the only visual evidence remaining of how the obelisk appeared in public. The sides of the obelisk undoubtedly were of oil paper with imagery painted upon them. As the obelisk was lit from inside, the paper would have been somewhat transparent. These materials would be consistent with the oil-papered window displays later used by Revere in March of 1771, when he honored the one-year anniversary of the Boston Massacre with transparent paintings hung in the windows of his home. Atop the obelisk were 16 portraits, including Queen Charlotte, King George III, William Pitt, Lord George Sackville, and John Wilkes. The central portion of the structure included a lengthy description on each of its sides in 4 stanzas, promoting the ideals of liberty and effusive devotion to the king. The lower quadrants of the obelisk contained 4 allegorical scenes in which liberty comes to the aid of America, shown here as an Indian warrior. The vignettes demonstrate America in distress at the loss of liberty caused by the Stamp Act, followed by imploring assistance from Parliament. She endures this conflict for a short span of time, ultimately reunited with liberty through Minerva's intercession, and lastly, she has liberty restored by George III. The schematic rendering of these scenes is typical of Revere's handling of figural compositions in other works, and bears striking similarity to his engraving A View of the Year 1765. Copying from the 1763 English print, View of the Present Crisis, Revere maintained the placement of the majority of figures, recasting them as personifications of the colonies and members of the United Provinces. Revere's allegorical dragon represents the Stamp Act with the Magna Carta in its grips, while to the right, the figure of John Husk, who is associated with the passage of the Stamp Act, hangs an effigy from the Liberty Tree, as it did on November 1st, 1765. Revere clearly recycled the figures of Liberty, Minerva, and the Devil the following year on the obelisk. While the celebration was indeed occasioned by the repeal of the Stamp Act, the obelisk was a beacon in praise of George III and reminds us that although the Sons of Liberty called for the creation of the obelisk as a striking condemnation of parliamentary sovereignty, these were British subjects demonstrating loyalty to the crown, whether genuine or strategic. However, the obelisk represents a critical turning point in an inevitable divide between patriots and loyalists, colonists and crown, as the Stamp Act was viewed as an infringement upon civil rights and as harming the body politic. Phrases employed by members of the Sons of Liberty in 1766 before the Act's repeal. On Thursday, May 22nd, Boston newspapers, including the Massachusetts Gazette Extraordinary, provided a detailed account of the celebration during which the obelisk was displayed. Here we learn of the design, function, and fate of the obelisk. On the Common, the Sons of Liberty erected a magnificent pyramid, illuminated with 280 lamps, the 4 upper stories of which were ornamented with the figures of majesties and 14 of the worthy patriots who have distinguished themselves by their love of liberty. On the top of the pyramid was fixed a round box of fireworks horizontally. At 11 o'clock, the signal being given by a discharge of 21 rockets, the horizontal wheel on the top of the pyramid or obelisk was played off, ending in the discharge of 16 dozen of serpents in the air, which concluded the show. The pyramid, which was designed to be placed under the Tree of Liberty, as a standing monument of this glorious era, by accident took fire about 1 o'clock and was consumed. The lamps by which it was illuminated not being extinguished at the close of the scene, it is supposed to have taken fire by some of them. And thus the unfortunate demise of the obelisk. It is truly amazing that the obelisk did not catch fire earlier, with all of the fireworks displays happening over the course of the evening. The skies must have been awash with color, and the oral cacophony a spectacle to remember. Participants and bystanders had reason for concern of pyrotechnic mishaps. Fire insurers in 18th century London often sought after those who made, sold, or gave fireworks, including the serpents mentioned above, due to careless handling that resulted in discharges bursting through shop windows and wreaking havoc in the marketplace. Public displays of fireworks were often blamed in London for just this reason. The round box of fireworks horizontally or horizontal wheel mentioned atop the obelisk may have looked something like this, according to a popular 18th century Dutch manual on pyrotechnics. And as part of the evening's concluding display, the wheel was accompanied by 21 rockets and 16 dozen serpents, a finger-length explosive. One wonders, if the fireworks on the obelisk were ignited at the conclusion of the celebration at 11 p.m., after which the crowds dispersed peacefully, what happened between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. when the obelisk caught fire? Esther Forbes suggests that either the 300 lighted lamps within or an escaped rocket finished it off. But if the lamps had not been extinguished before the crowd left the common, surely someone would have taken notice. Likewise, as the obelisk was intended to be moved to the Liberty Tree, wouldn't members of the Sons of Liberty have ensured that all candles were extinguished? And given Revere's background as an artillery lieutenant during the French and Indian War, he, among others, would have been cognizant of the precautions necessary for the handling of incendiary devices. The early morning hour of its destruction raises questions as to whether indeed the lamps remained lit unattended, or if someone returned purposefully under cover of darkness to destroy the obelisk as a loyalist gesture in opposition to the Sons of Liberty, or perhaps even a member of the Sons of Liberty as a symbolic act in defiance of George III. Revere's engraving gives rise to additional questions. Who designed the obelisk? Who composed the text? Who painted the vignettes? And why were those scenes chosen? Why an obelisk? Given its placement on the common for public display and its ability to hold a wheel of fireworks, the obelisk's height certainly would have been impressive. The sides would have been constructed of large sheets of paper, perhaps from some of the last stamped sheets prior to the repeal of the Stamp Act, rubbed with oil to achieve transparency when illuminated by lamps placed inside the structure's pyramidal form, and affixed to a wooden frame mounted on a Doric base. By way of comparison, the memorial obelisk at the Old North Bridge in Concord on its Doric base makes for an interesting suggestion as to how high the obelisk may have stood. While we don't know who was responsible for the physical construction of the monument, the form it took has political and social significance. The obelisk is an important symbol in Masonic history, and many of the Sons of Liberty were Freemasons, which suggests perhaps why the obelisk commissioned by the Sons of Liberty took the form that it did. Revere includes in his engravings title the words "under Liberty Tree," which implies that although the final structure never made it to its intended destination, Revere was involved in those conversations about the design, construction, and ultimate placement of the obelisk. Consider that the Stamp Act was repealed in March. News of its repeal was announced in Boston on May 16, and the Sons of Liberty advertised on Saturday, May 17, to hold a public celebration on the Common 2 days later on May 19, at which time Revere's engraving of the obelisk was already for sale at Eady's and Gill. Such a timeline would have provided only 2 days at most for the entire concept, design, and construction to take place, in which Revere would have had to prepare a plate, engrave the image, and deliver it to Eady's and Gill, to ink, print, pull sheets, dry them, and then offer them for sale. But in his diary, John Adams recalled a meeting months earlier, on January 15, 1766, with the decorative painter Thomas Crafts Jr. and George Trott, a jeweler. Quote, "Spent the evening with the Sons of Liberty at their own apartment in Hanover Square, near the Tree of Liberty. I was invited by Crafts and Trott to go and spend an evening with them and some others. They chose a committee to make preparations for grand rejoicings upon the arrival of the news of a repeal of the Stamp Act. And I heard afterwards they are to have such illuminations, bonfires, pyramids, obelisks, such grand exhibitions, and such fireworks as never were seen before in America. I wish they may be disappointed." Adams' entry tells us that plans for the obelisk began 4 months prior in anticipation of the Act's repeal. A letter to Adams from Crafts a month after their initial meeting suggests the secretive nature of their gatherings, along with a request, quote, "Yesterday, I wrote you a few lines by Dr. Tufts, informing you the Sons of Liberty desired your company at Boston next Wednesday, and mentioned for what occasion. I would now desire it as a favor if you can spare the time to come on Monday next, because they want you to write those inscriptions that I mentioned to you when last at Boston. One in favor of liberty, not forgetting the true-born sons, and another with encomiums on King George, expressive of our loyalty. P.S. Destroy this after reading it. The direction from Crafts to Adams that he destroy the letter suggests the evidence of additional correspondence regarding preparations for the celebration deemed too sensitive to preserve. Further, the inscription Crafts refers to, one in favor of liberty and encomiums to King George expressive of our loyalty, mirror those represented on the obelisk as revealed in Revere's engraving. Adams certainly would have been sympathetic to the son's request. On January 1st of 1766, he wrote in his diary, "This year brings ruin or salvation to the British colonies. The eyes of all America are fixed on the British Parliament. In short, Britain and America are staring at each other, and they will probably stare more and more for some time." It is quite possible that Adams was instrumental in the composition of the verse created for the sides of the obelisk. Perhaps not in its entirety, but Crafts' request for inscriptions suggests plausibility. Revere did not often write the inscription for his engraving, as was the case with the 1768 A Warm Place, Hell, which was written by Dr. Benjamin Church, a fellow member of the North End Caucus, said to excel in writing Whig poetry. The obelisk was a collaborative effort for many hands, including those of Crafts and Revere. As Forbes asserted, Revere's shop may have been crowded with cronies giving advice, helping in the symbolism of the verses. Much of the expression of Whig sentiment was more of a mass than an individual effort. Within this network of patriots, Crafts may not have associated much with Adams, but he knew Revere well. Crafts was the commander of the Massachusetts Regiment Artillery in which Revere served. He participated in the Boston Tea Party and was an active Freemason like Revere. Crafts advertised his business of selling colors and artist supplies from his shop, both wholesale and retail. He sold linseed oil, varnish, an extensive selection of oil paints, brushes, palette knives, gold and silver leaf, and an assortment of mezzotinto prints. In fact, Crafts maintained all of the supplies necessary for painting the oil paper sides of an obelisk. Although many questions remain about the origins, construction, and ultimate destruction of the obelisk remain, Nan Wolverton and Lauren Hewes provided a unique opportunity for visitors of Beyond Midnight Paul Revere to experience the scale and interactivity as intended by the Sons of Liberty. This full-size replica of the obelisk, according to Revere's engravings and the facts gathered from the correspondence and newspaper accounts presented here, took place of pride at both the New York Historical Society and now at the Concord Museum, where it is on display until the 12th. It may have taken 254 years to bring the obelisk back to its impressive stature. However, unlike the original obelisk, this version will be maintained for years to come in its new home at the Paul Revere School in Revere, Massachusetts, but this time without the fireworks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I'm going to ask Teresa to put her video back on and start her audio back up. We've had a few questions and we have about 25 minutes to go through them. So I'm going to give you the first question. It's really from Mr. J.L. Bell. I don't know Mr. or Mrs. J.L. Bell. He says, or she, I see that Kristen Remick added his name in pen to some copies of Revere's Massacre print, indicating that he colored those copies. How many did he do? There's such a variation in the coloring that I wonder, do we have evidence of other colorists?
I'm sure there are other colorists because the hands are very different. It doesn't look like there was a prototype that certain people followed. So I've always assumed they were different hands. And I have not seen that many with Christian Remick's signature. He signed the landing of the troops.
Yeah.
But I've been told that certain ones were done by Christian Remick, but they weren't signed. So I think that may be one of those myths that basically gets disseminated, but please tell me what ones you've seen that are signed, because I haven't seen all of them. But a lot of the issues in terms of the different coloring, I think, has to do with the condition of the piece. I mean, many of these are in very poor condition. I have tried to see ones in good condition, and I see variations. For instance, Yale's has on the boots and the heads, tricorner hats, it has a clear lacquer. It's darkened a little bit, or what you might call a glaze, I'm sure, to make it bear out and look more prominent. I think also I see variations in the reds. Red lead is obviously what Yale's was because it darkened. But they could have used other reds like vermilion, madder, red oak. All of those would have been available. I think Yale's also, if I remember, has a shiny yellow gamboge, and I don't think yours did. Lauren.
Doesn't, no.
Yeah. And the greens are quite different
Yeah.
in the different ones. I mean, what was available was verdigris, sap green. Malachite's really expensive, so I doubt, people would have used that. It's, a crushed stone. And the blues vary too.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of blues available at that time, relatively. I mean, indigo, smalt, possibly Prussian blue. It sort of looks like it might be, but you really have to test them to know that. But they wouldn't have used azurite or lapis because that's too expensive.
And they were moving pretty quickly to get these prints out to market. So it's possible, since we know that Revere had a relationship with Remick from the Landing of the Troops print, it's possible that a few got to Remick, which he then signed, and that the others may have gone out without color and been colored after the purchase.
I think that's very likely because they do look different. It's
very
not
much
like English. It's not like in English prints where there was a model that certain people were copying. Not copying. Well, they were following the model for the hand coloring. So I think there are a lot of different ones, different hands.
Very good. Very good. We have another question for Teresa. The repurposing of the Boston Massacre print as an abolition image is fascinating. Can you speak a bit more on how the figure of Crispus Attucks and other facets of the print were recast for a 19th century audience? And that question comes from Rebecca Rosen.
Well, I've seen a number of different versions of the Boston Massacre by different artists, and they do put Christian Remick in the forefront and make him very much a prominent figure. I can't remember off the top of my head what the different versions are. I can send them to you. But there were a number of them, not just the chapney that I showed. But I do think that he became a figure for abolitionists to try and promote liberty and freedom for slaves. I think it's sort of obvious, but I don't know that, Lauren, maybe you know more about what people have written about it. But there are a lot of images.
Yeah, I did a piece on the Stratton image in the catalog, which does talk a little bit about the repurposing on the rediscovery of the massacre print and then the repurposing of the massacre print. And it was, of course, taken up by abolitionists, and the poem that we all know, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride, was done as an abolitionist poem to try to unite the country, to remind us during the Civil War, pre-Civil War era, that we were all one. We had one common history. The chapney that you showed, there's a second version of that print that came out right away. After that, there are two very full-size, much larger than the original massacre print, that were distributed very inexpensive and were probably widely available in New England. I don't have any evidence that they were sold outside of New England, but I do know that they were sold in Boston. So I hope that helps some of the questions.
And it's a Boston printer. I mean,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
basically, even in the original Revere print, they buried Crispus Attucks along with the other people who were killed. I mean, he was honored in a way that the others were.
Yes, exactly. A question for Nancy from Melissa Trafton. Nancy, do you know of other examples of oilcloth monuments like the obelisk and Revere's window hangings? Was this a typical building material for temporary decoration?
That's a great question, thank you. Yes, there were, in fact, during that night of celebrations, not only was the obelisk there, but there were other oiled papered scenes that were tacked up into windows that were overlooking the celebration. So in fact, it was relatively popular.
All right, thank you. Another one from Mr. J.L. Bell. From the Washington Monument to the pillar at Concord's North Bridge, obelisks seem usually to be memorials for the dead, aside from the, quote, Dead Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty obelisk doesn't memorialize anybody. Are there other examples of celebratory obelisks during the Revolutionary period?
That's a great question. I don't know. Lauren, can you help me out?
I don't know either. If there's an architectural historian here, please let us know.
I know, that's fantastic. I mean, there are ones that are erected later, post-battle.
Right.
But during the time period, I mean, I think that the selection of the obelisk as its shape may have been this veiled or not so veiled suggestion about the death of the Stamp Act, thinking in that terms, but also I think linking it to the idea of Masonic imagery bears a lot of weight, and I know that Nan has written on that as well, has recently published on that.
You also see the obelisk a lot in mourning pictures, textiles, and miniatures, so it's not an unusual imagery for the period.
I have a follow-up for Nancy from Wendy Cooper. Following up on Melissa Grafton's question, are there British precedents for oilcloth monuments?
I know they did a lot with oiling things for transparency and for viewing them in theatrical manners, but I don't know specifically outside of the big panoramas that they did in England of structural pieces.
As a public monument, it doesn't come to mind, but one would think, given how substantial this was, that this wasn't just a, well, let's build it this way. I mean, clearly I imagine there would have been some kind of material precedent for this with the people involved in the construction of this, because it was massive in its size.
Right, right. There are a lot of shipbuilders in Boston too. Size doesn't scare these people. They're used to using very large structural pieces. But it's a good question to know if there's a precedent of fabric covered, celebratory monuments in Europe. Because the Dutch images that you showed of the fireworks were terrific. A question for Teresa. What is the relative rarity today of extant massacre prints by the other various engravers?
Surprisingly, the Pelhams are very rare.
There are two.
And the Mulligans are pretty rare.
Yep.
And the Reveres are most plentiful.
That's correct. Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, I think there's some of the censuses have been for Mulligan is somewhere between 15 and 18 known impressions. Yeah. The Pelham is known in 2, and the Bingley is, of course, bound in a book. So that has a good number of printings are available for the 18th century copies. But it's the Revere that is the
plentiful one.
Most, that's more thick on the ground.
He had 500 printed.
Right.
And I think again, if they were framed, they survived longer. Mm-hmm. And with his name, those were the things that people valued because of his, he was a patriot in a way.
Right.
The other 2 weren't.
Right. And we should also mention the broadside that you showed, Teresa. That's the only known complete printing of that broadside. That's actually on view right now at the Worcester Art Museum. There's a partial, just the top half of it that's known, but so the broadside is actually the rarest of them all,
And I think, again, ephemeral things like newspapers weren't really necessarily kept. And that's probably why there's so few.
Right, and the broadside would have been pinned up outside, right? That wouldn't have been framed in somebody's parlor. That was meant to be posted for people to read, and so it would have been rained on and everything else.
I think that the very bold red blood and redcoats was something that engaged people, because you find that in all of them.
Agreed. Right. Nancy, this is a question from Wayne Curtis. Nancy, is there any contemporary description of the display at Revere's residence, assuming they were in the second and third story windows? Do we know what the content was?
There's some fantastic newspaper accounts that talk about that Revere recreated some of the sort of iconic imagery related to the massacre, and that's what he placed up in his windows. As at the 1 year anniversary, these would have been easily seen from his home. Those of you who know where his home is, how easily that would have been seen from the street. And so he replicated the process of the massacre. It was more than one, so it wasn't just one image that he had up in his window. But there are some pretty detailed accounts in the newspapers.
Love those historic newspapers.
Yes.
Question from Martha McNamara for Nancy. Is there any evidence that thought was given to make a permanent monument modeled on Revere's obelisk in the 18th century or later?
Well, the idea was that originally this was going to be moved under the Liberty Tree. It was supposed to be kept as a standing monument. You have to question sort of the longevity of that given the materials that would have been used. But after that, there was no more discussion. Once it was summarily destroyed, it doesn't come up again. And so Revere's engraving is so incredibly important for us. And there are only 2 extant copies of that we know of. There's rumor of a third. But I haven't verified that, but there's only 2 of those that remain. So aside from the newspaper accounts and the Revere engraving, that's what remains of our knowledge of the obelisk.
Yeah, thank goodness for that, right? Visual reference.
Right. Or I guess I should say, until today, with the recreated one, that's right now.
Thank you, yes.
Museum, of course. So yes, Martha, there actually is. There is an obelisk, yes.
Yeah, and that process is something we can talk about tomorrow in the next session, but the process of having that obelisk made was quite fascinating. This is a question from Robert Wong. He says, I believe that the Revere print showed someone firing at the crowd from the balcony above the British soldiers. Was this ever proven historically to have occurred? And I have our copy up here, and I don't see a figure firing from above the balcony. I think what he's seeing is maybe the those diagonal lines that go down to hold the trade signs on like Butcher's Hall, you know, down the row.
Well, some of them.
Do they have somebody up there?
I'm not saying it's the Revere, but I know that some of the other Boston Massacre prints, which are not necessarily the same image, do have people firing. And I don't think there's probably any proof that occurred, because this was just a street brawl that really blew up when more people came in. And if anyone's wondering about the sticks, and I'd be interested for people's feedback, a lot of them in the chapney are carrying the same sort of sticks, and those are called bouldering sticks. And they're used in rope making and cable making, because I was wondering why they all looked so similar. Does anyone know?
The crowd was kind of a diverse group. There were some definite, and Nan is weighing in saying that was propaganda, just like the scene itself. They were in the district where there were rope walks and lots of sailor people in the industry of sailing. So, but it's more likely to be the propaganda, as Nan has noted.
No, I agree. I just was curious if anyone knew how they worked.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, let's see if
Because
we'll see if we get an answer for that.
There's splicing sticks that are different.
Let's see if we get an answer to somebody who knows how rope is made. Another question from Joseph Deneen. In the hell print, so this would be for Nancy, in the hell print, due to the presence of the weather vane, the hell mouth seems to be in front of the province house. Is Revere tying support for the royal provincial government to eternal damnation? Question mark.
In that scene, I'm just pulling it up right now. So I can
Yep. And I believe Amanda just put a link in the chat to the AAS copy.
Yeah, terrific. That's a fantastic question. Yeah, I think that Revere's position as a patriot, like in Rob Martello's fantastic book, he talks about Revere as a mechanic and merchant, politician, and patriot. And so I think that he absolutely has these very dedicated moments when he's making these engravings to voice incredible damnation here about the idea of hell, and that scene is so horrific for us. And the idea of consuming political bodies for him, I think that makes a great analogy.
I have a question for both of you. It occurred to me as I was listening to your papers that Revere, and actually to all the sessions this week on Revere as a printmaker, when Revere's prints were being shown, Revere is something of an amalgamist, right? He's combining things, he's reusing things. In the case of the Pelham, he's borrowing entire compositions. That's something I think, could you both address how that process with Revere, how do you square that up with the work that you're doing? I guess, Teresa, let's start with you, since the massacre was something that he both copied and then was copied from him,
Well, I don't think that was uncommon in the 18th century. There wasn't really copyright. And that's one thing that Hogarth desperately wanted to, get enforced. But I think a lot of his prints are borrowed from, or he's taken images from other things and combined them. And Nan talks about it in her essay with King Philip. But in a way, there's a long history of people training themselves by copying prints in America. So I don't think it was frowned upon the way we do. I mean, obviously, Pelham was out of a lot of money because he didn't sell very many.
Yeah, he was scooped. Nancy, do you want to address that? You got at that with the Minerva reappearing and the devil reappearing.
Sure. In line with what Teresa's saying, there was very little regard for the Hogarth Act of 1735. And so the idea of copying work was quite common. I think in my own work, sometimes I come up against my sort of my own opinions of Revere's work in terms of as an original artist and Revere's work as a copyist. And he's a brilliant copyist. And that in itself, I think, needs to stand out as having great merit. So if, for example, if you look at his engravings for the Royal American magazine, he's making copies of those. When he does, for example, The Able Doctor or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught, he copies that almost exactly. He makes a slight variation and he labels the pot as containing tea. But his work in copying is really how he made a large percentage of his income on piecework, as well as these commissions. For something like the trade cards that he would make, right? So he would use the same designs, something like the Jackson and the Breck trade cards. They're the same, but he can personalize them. So I think he was very strategic. Not only the times at which he was compelled to copy English examples for the commissions that he would have for magazines, but also the ways that he could conserve his time and effort and using his own images to repurpose them in terms of the mercantile trade. Those things, I think, as a copyist really stand out. And it also begs the question about the importance of emblem books. And clearly these were sources that he was looking at in great detail. The trade cards that he makes, for example, the Joseph Webb card with these beautiful flourishes, Well, those designs were easily found in emblem books at the time.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we have one.
Can I
Go ahead.
just-
Yeah, go ahead, Teresa.
I do think it's interesting, though, his propaganda prints. If you're looking, at it as a print, yes, he's fast, he gets them out, but the beauty in terms of his technique is nothing compared to the beauty of the things that he engraves for trade cards and silver. They're quite crude, and they're mostly etched. And I think that's interesting because it shows that he's conserving his energy, to make beautiful things for what he's selling in terms of individuals. And the propaganda stuff, he gets out fast and he sells those too. But the same level of care is not taken.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. We have one last question, and we have about 11 minutes left. So the last question is from David Belagic. I'm going to kill your name. I'm so sorry. Belagic. He writes, there is an anti-Stamp Act political cartoon attributed to John Singleton Copley. Is there any possibility that Revere would have consulted Copley on the Obelisk project? We know that Copley did attend a Sons of Liberty banquet in 1769.
So I would say yes, right? We know that these networks were very close. And David's own work on Masonic imagery, I have to say, is brilliant. So I'm plugging his work right here. But yes, I think absolutely. And one of the sort of masterful things that I think Nan and Lauren have done with this exhibition is created a framework to understand Revere, not just as an artisan or as a patriot or as a merchant, but to really see the interconnectivity of this very extensive web of individuals operating in Boston at the time. So absolutely, I agree with what your comment is, absolutely, that they would have had time to converse with one another. There was a fluidity of ideas as well. I mean, I think that also during this time period, from the time of the repeal of the Stamp Act up through the mid-1770s, there's a searching for iconography of imageries that will best represent this struggle. And so, yeah, thank you for that comment.
We've had one last question come in from Reva Wolf. Some of the trade cards seem to be modeled after British examples, including of Freemasons. This is a topic on which more work can be done, which is, I feel very much the same way, that there's a lot of work. I remember we first were going to do the exhibition, I thought, what more can be said? What can possibly be said about Paul Revere? And I think still now, we've queued up, there's even more work to be done. But Nancy, would you like to address that?
Oh, absolutely. I think these are rich documents. And as we'll talk more about in the next session, the roundtable, I teach a History of Prints in America class, and I use things like the trade card specifically to talk about the life of an object. And so not only can we see this in terms of Revere's production as an artisan or as an artist, the extent to which you want to say the designs are original versus copied, but also the imagery that's contained therein, that they are oftentimes representative of what somebody is selling at their store. They might be generic, pots and pans and the like, but they really are important visual advertisements. And I think it speaks very much to how we think of advertising today, that if something is text laden, it doesn't necessarily have the same impact as something that's visual, right? And so for the Joseph Webb, I think he produced 150 of those trade cards for him to pass out. The number of which that still survive today are relatively small. To me, it's fascinating that those works are considered ephemera, right, of what exists and what no longer exists. But yes, there's so much work to be done on the trade cards. They're beautiful examples. Yes, they have a British precedent to them. Yes, they are imported fundamentally by Revere in terms of how he uses that for trade in Boston, and they are rich with information, absolutely.
And were used in a very ephemeral manner for accounting. Often on the back is the transaction between whoever walked into the trade person's shop and bought whatever all that is annotated on the back. So it's like a receipt,
Yeah,
essentially.
absolutely.
Which is,
and it's so fascinating today to think about, we wouldn't think today that that would be a piece of ephemera. If you come across a Revere trade card, my gosh, that's a prized possession. So it's interesting to think historically how pieces of paper function and their value changes over time.
Exactly. Nan, do we have time for one more question? I
I
see you pop in.
I popped in, and I'm going to ask a quick question, then I'll go away so you can get to the final question. But I wanted to ask Teresa, because I know you've worked on sort of gathering where all the examples of Revere's prints are out there. Can you say a few words about how many you think there are?
Well,
Are you continuing to do that work?
I am continuing to do it. I was interested to see on the Worcester website, they said that there were 70. I don't know where that came up. There may be 70. I haven't found 70. I mean, we know there are at least, 30. It's interesting where they're tucked away. They're not all in museums or private collections. They're sometimes in libraries. And because of the importance of them for Americans, they have been treasured and kept. Unfortunately, the ones that weren't framed have often been pretty well battered and treated poorly. So they're sort of not what they would have been. But I don't honestly know how many there are.
Maybe just a quick related question too, because I know you, and I think Lauren, you could probably weigh on this as well. What can you tell us about the frames of the originals? Because you did mention frames briefly, but would be helpful to hear a little bit about 18th century frames and ones that you've seen in frame of this print.
I've seen black painted frames, black frames that have inner, fillets of some sort of gold, molded gold image. I don't want to say they're Hogarth type frames, but if you have to say something, they're sort of like that. But if you look at the one for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, that one is gorgeous. It has gold leaf for stars, for the moon, for the clock's hands. And it was a treasured item and put in a frame that preserved it. But I haven't systematically made notes. I have taken, pictures. But basically, the whole issue of frames is complicated because people do repurpose frames very often. And unless you can take something apart and examine it, it's hard to know if it's original. That's sort of my feeling. I mean, now you can see that it's old, but you don't know that it's original unless there's provenance. What do you think, Lauren?
I think I was just going to say the example of the massacre that's on view in Concord is an example of great provenance. That piece is in a very standard black, no gold fillet, a very inexpensive standard 18th century black frame. And I should mention also they weren't using mats then, so the glass, the print is right in against the glass, and that is a very simple, affordable black frame. The Chicago Historical has another really beautiful copy similar to the MFA's with the gold highlights, and those would have been like just exquisite in candlelight, because they would have reflected that. So the experience of having that framed on the wall makes a lot of sense rather than, stuffed in your portfolio of prints that you would share with your company of unframed material. So those things coexisted, framed prints and unframed prints in a household. So the choice to have something framed, in this case, we have a propaganda element going on and a patriotic element going on, but also the very finest ones, I think, ended up in frames and hung up where people could see them.
And along with what Lauren has said, all prints at that time were what they called close frame. They were the size of the object.
Right.
It's and in many ways, I'd like it a lot. And for anyone who's trying to reframe things, I have found a frame maker who loves to make 18th century frames, and he's cheap.
I'm going to go with our last question. It's 3:10. We just have 5 minutes. This may be for Nancy or Nan. Actually, stay on. Don't go away. It's a ceramics question. Were any of the Revere prints or designs used on transfers for ceramics?
Oh, I think there is an able doctor.
Ooh.
On transferware.
Nan, do you want to mention the punch bowl, which is not transferware, but it is his design?
Yeah, so
and let's think about the able doctor.
Yeah, that's interesting, Nancy. I that's not sure about that, but that's, if there is one, I'd love to know. So yeah, the punch bowl, which is on view at the Worcester Art Museum currently, has a painted design that is based on one of Revere's Masonic certificates. And so we know that what that indicates is that one of Revere's certificates, he created hundreds of these for Masonic lodges throughout New England, would have traveled over to China, to the factories, and the imagery was copied directly onto this beautiful punch bowl under the glaze before it was glazed. And so that is a wonderful way to see how his imagery traveled great distances, that it wasn't just within the confines of Boston. So yeah, it's a nice example of some of Revere's work on ceramics, albeit through the artists probably in the Canton factories.
And the ones I'm thinking of would have been, the able doctor I'm thinking of, would have been about 1830 or so.
Later.
In terms of stature, would have been later. For something like Able Doctor was one of these prints that had an incredibly long life. It was reproduced well into the 1890s. And that print was reproduced with, so in the scene, America, her ship is being raised with the Earl of Sandwich peeking underneath it. But in the 1890s, there's this late Victorian version of it where her ship is safely down. And even with that, they sort of modified this for a greater moral purpose. But that image is one that was reproduced widely in a variety of different formats.
All right, I'm going to say that's our last question. So we've gotten through all the questions. And Nan, first of all, let me thank both Nancy and Teresa for your papers and for your handling of all the questions that came in from our participants. And Nan, I'm going to turn it over to you for the logistics. But thank you both.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's part of the logistics. Thank you so much, all three of you, for this great panel. And for our viewers out there, thank you so much for attending. And I hope that you'll be able to join us at 3:30 for the final panel, the final session of the symposium, in which we will just have a wrap up with all of the speakers in the form of a roundtable. So if you are able to join us, we'd love to see you there. And if you are unable to join us for that and would like to follow up and see that on our YouTube channel, you can do that as you can with all of the other panels for this symposium. So those should be up and ready to view in the coming days. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you, some of you at least, in another 15 minutes. And please go to our website to look up other programs in the future and to find out more about AAS, our collections, and our programs. Thank you so very much.